They were told to sit quietly because a small radio had been placed on a wooden table, and the guard said nothing unusual was happening. Yet when the sound began, it did not resemble marching songs, not folk music, and not anything they recognized from home, but a strange flowing rhythm full of sudden turns and lively instruments. And as the notes filled the room, the prisoners exchanged uncertain looks, wondering how music could sound so free in the middle of a war and why a nation fighting a global conflict would still create sounds that felt playful, improvised, and alive, leaving one silent question in their minds. What kind of country plays music like this while the world is burning? The room they were led into that afternoon was not a place of discipline and not a space built to intimidate, but a simple wooden recreation room that smelled of dust, old floorboards, and a faint trace of tobacco. And although nothing in the room looked threatening, the prisoners carried their usual caution into it, because any gathering inside a camp could turn without warning into rules, inspections, or messages that changed the shape of the day. A small radio sat on a table near the wall, its wooden casing scratched and dull, its speaker cloth slightly loose, and to them it looked like another American object whose purpose might be harmless, but whose meaning could not be trusted. Because prisoners learn quickly that objects can be used to control mood as easily as fences control movement, and even a quiet device can become part of the system if it changes how men feel. They entered slowly and took their places without speaking, some sitting, others staying close to the wall, not to show defiance, but because standing kept the body alert and allowed the mind to watch everything. And they wore the same worn civilian-style camp clothing they used every day, work jackets faded by washing, thin shirts with soft collars, loose trousers that never fit perfectly, fabric that looked issued rather than chosen. And nothing about them suggested soldiers or authority, only men whose identities had been reduced to routine. The guards did not shout and did not rush them, and the relaxed tone alone made the room feel uncertain, because prisoners understand strict structure better than casual openness. And when structure loosens, the mind begins to search for hidden intent, asking what is being tested, what is being offered, and what will be expected in return. Outside, the distant camp sounds continued as they always did, footsteps on gravel, a truck somewhere beyond the fence, wind moving through dry grass. And those sounds reminded them that this moment was not freedom, but a pause inside captivity. And yet the radio suggested a connection to a world beyond the camp, beyond the barracks, beyond the routines that repeated until days lost their edges. One guard finally reached for the dial, turning it slowly, and the room filled with the thin, restless crackle of static, a sound that made several prisoners lift their heads slightly, because static meant distance, and distance meant cities, streets, living rooms, and ordinary life still happening somewhere else. And even the possibility of hearing that world carried weight for men who had been cut off from it. They expected a voice, a formal broadcast, news, or something structured, because structure is easier to interpret than ambiguity, but the static did not resolve into speech, and instead it thinned into the first drifting fragments of music, sounds that seemed to appear in pieces, as if instruments were warming up rather than performing. And this immediately puzzled them, because in their experience, music usually arrived with clear shape, clear melody, and clear direction. Then the notes became steadier, a light swinging rhythm that did not resemble marching music and did not carry the heavy seriousness they associated with wartime. And the looseness of it made them exchange cautious glances, because it sounded playful in a way that felt almost inappropriate inside a world at war, and they could not decide whether it was meant to entertain, to distract, or to make them feel something they were not prepared to feel. They listened without moving, because observation had become their safest first response to anything unfamiliar. And in that quiet room, with sunlight falling across the wooden floor and the radio humming softly on the table, they began to encounter a sound that did not command, did not discipline, and did not belong to war at all. And the confusion it created was not about music itself, but about what it implied. That beyond the fences a nation could still create something free, improvised, and alive. The music continued to flow from the radio with a rhythm that felt loose and unpredictable. And this alone made it difficult for them to understand, because they were used to songs that followed clear patterns, songs built for marching, ceremonies, or familiar traditions. And what they heard now seemed to move in sudden turns, with instruments rising and falling in ways that did not feel controlled. And the absence of strict structure made several of them listen with quiet concentration, as if trying to solve a puzzle rather than enjoy a melody. They searched for something recognizable inside the sound, a steady beat to follow or a repeated theme to hold on to. But the music seemed to wander freely, and this wandering quality created a strange tension in their minds, because captivity had trained them to expect order in everything. And when order disappears, the mind works harder to interpret what it hears, trying to find rules even where none are intended. Some focused on the trumpet-like tones that rose brightly and then softened. Others noticed the steady pulse underneath. And even those who did not understand the style could sense that the musicians were not playing from rigid instruction, but from expression. And this idea alone felt foreign, because expression suggests choice, and choice suggests freedom, and freedom was not a concept they associated with daily life anymore. The guards did not explain what the music was, and a lack of explanation made the moment feel even more unusual, because information normally came with context, and context helps the mind place an experience inside a clear frame. But here there was only sound filling the room, sound arriving from far beyond the camp, from cities and studios, and people living lives untouched by fences, and that distance gave the music a quiet emotional weight. They were not reacting with smiles or visible emotion, but with attentive stillness, because stillness allowed them to observe without committing to a feeling, and men who had learned to protect their inner world often listened carefully before deciding what something meant, and this careful listening became a shared silent behavior in the room. The rhythm carried a sense of movement, almost like conversation between instruments, and this conversational quality felt unusual to men who were used to commands rather than exchanges. And although they could not name the style, they sensed that it belonged to a culture where music was not only performance but also personality, and that idea quietly challenged their expectations of what wartime society might value. For a brief moment, the camp around them felt psychologically farther away, not because it disappeared, but because their attention had traveled elsewhere, following the sound into an unseen world. And this mental movement reminded them that life outside still held spaces for creativity, for leisure, and for expression, even while the war continued. No one spoke about these thoughts because such reflections were personal and difficult to express, and yet the shared silence suggested that many were processing the same quiet realization, that the country holding them captive also produced music that sounded alive and unrestrained. And this contradiction did not create anger, but curiosity, a curiosity they kept mostly to themselves. As the piece continued, they stopped trying to categorize it and simply listened. And in doing so, they experienced something rare inside captivity, a moment not tied to orders, labor, or survival, but to perception alone. And that shift from function to listening, from reacting to observing, marked the beginning of a subtle internal change, where sound became more than background noise and started to represent a glimpse of a different cultural world. The music eventually softened, but its impression remained because it had introduced an unfamiliar idea that a society at war could still make room for art that felt playful and free, and this idea lingered quietly in their thoughts, not dramatic and not overwhelming, but steady, like a question forming slowly, asking what kind of country allows such sounds to exist while conflict shapes the world. As the music continued to echo in their thoughts, even after certain notes faded, the experience began to shift from simple listening to quiet reflection, because the mind does not encounter something unfamiliar without trying to understand what it represents. And for men living inside routine and restriction, any contact with the outside world carried meaning beyond the moment itself. They began to consider what this music revealed about the society beyond the fences, because sound does not appear from nothing. It comes from people, from places, from time invested in creation rather than survival. And this suggested a world where daily life still allowed room for culture, for leisure, and for personal expression. And that idea alone created a subtle contrast with their own lives shaped by schedules, counts, and assigned tasks. The realization did not arrive as emotion, but as thought, because strong emotion had long been tempered by captivity, and what remained was a quieter form of awareness, where observations settled slowly and formed impressions rather than reactions. And this slower mental processing had become a habit for men who learned to conserve their inner energy. Some remembered music from home, structured songs tied to tradition, community gatherings, or military bands, and comparing those memories to what they had just heard highlighted the difference even more, because this American sound felt less formal, less directed, and more spontaneous. And spontaneity suggests a culture comfortable with individuality, a concept that felt distant from their current reality. They did not interpret this as admiration or criticism, but as information, another piece of understanding about the country around them. And prisoners often collected such details quietly, building an internal picture of the world they were temporarily living inside, because understanding the environment, even culturally, provided a sense of orientation. The idea that musicians somewhere were playing not for war, not for propaganda, and not for command, but simply to perform, added a layer of quiet curiosity, because it suggested that life outside the camp still moved along personal interests and creative pursuits, and that continuity of culture during wartime felt both reassuring and distancing at the same time. Reassuring, because it meant the world had not collapsed entirely into conflict, and distancing, because it reminded them they were separated from that continuity, and separation from normal life often weighed heavier than physical restriction, since it touches identity rather than movement. They remained calm on the outside, yet internally the experience added another small shift in perception, where the country holding them captive appeared not only as a military force, but also as a society with its own rhythms, tastes, and forms of expression. And this broader image complicated the simple categories of enemy and captor that war often creates. No deep conclusions were spoken, and no visible reactions marked the moment, because such experiences worked quietly inside the mind, shaping impressions over time rather than all at once. And for men in captivity, slow understanding often replaced quick judgment. By the time their attention returned fully to the room around them, the music had already done its work, not by entertaining them, but by showing a glimpse of a world still capable of creativity. And that glimpse, small as it was, expanded their awareness beyond the fence line, reminding them that beyond routine and restriction, life continued with sounds they had never expected to hear in the middle of a war. Even after the radio was turned down and the room returned to its usual quiet, the music did not fully leave them, because unfamiliar experiences often remain longer in thought than in sound. And the mind continues to examine what it cannot easily classify, especially in a life where new impressions are rare and repetition dominates most days. As they walked back through the camp later, the normal sights surrounded them again. The fences, the barracks, the guarded paths, and the routines that shaped each hour. Yet something subtle had shifted in how they perceived those surroundings, not because the camp had changed, but because their awareness had briefly traveled beyond it. And once the mind travels, even through sound, it does not return exactly the same. The rhythm they had heard seemed to contrast with the predictability of camp life, because jazz moved with variation while their days moved with sameness. And this contrast quietly highlighted how structured their existence had become, how each action followed another in expected order, and how little space remained for spontaneity inside captivity. They did not speak openly about these thoughts, because daily life among prisoners often focused on practical matters rather than reflection, and yet shared experiences leave quiet traces in group memory, where men understand each other without needing long explanations, and a few exchanged brief looks that suggested mutual recognition of the unusual moment they had all witnessed. The guards treated the event as ordinary, as if playing the radio required no special meaning. And that normal attitude itself revealed something about the culture outside, because it showed that such music was not rare or ceremonial, but part of everyday life. And realizing this made the experience feel less like a performance and more like a window into routine American culture. For some prisoners, the thought that people beyond the camp could listen to music for enjoyment during wartime felt difficult to reconcile at first. Yet the longer they considered it, the more it suggested that civilian life continues in parallel with conflict, maintaining its own patterns, comforts, and distractions. And this parallel existence added complexity to how they viewed the world beyond the fence. The music also reminded them that culture does not pause entirely during war, that art, entertainment, and personal interests often survive even in difficult times. And this realization neither improved nor worsened their situation, but it broadened their understanding of the society around them. Their own lives remained governed by routine, work details, and scheduled movements. And the contrast between those routines and the free-flowing sound they had heard created a quiet awareness of how limited their environment was, not only physically but culturally, because exposure shapes perception, and limited exposure narrows it. Still, the experience did not create frustration as much as contemplation, because captivity had already taught them to manage expectations carefully, and strong reactions rarely changed circumstances, while calm observation helped preserve inner balance. By evening, the camp returned fully to its familiar rhythm, yet the memory of the music lingered as a small mental note, a reminder that beyond the fences existed a culture expressive enough to create such sounds, and that reminder settled quietly into their understanding of the world they were temporarily separated from, adding another layer to how they interpreted the country around them, without changing the reality they still lived inside. As days passed, and the routine of camp life continued to repeat itself in the same measured patterns, the memory of that music did not disappear, but settled quietly into their thoughts, returning at unexpected moments, because the mind often revisits what it does not fully understand. And for men living inside restriction, even a small, unfamiliar experience could leave a lasting impression. The sound they had heard began to shape a slightly more complex image of the country around them, not replacing their understanding of war and not erasing the reality of captivity, but adding another layer to it, because it showed that the society holding them was not only defined by soldiers and commands, but also by civilians, artists, and everyday people living ordinary lives beyond military structures. This realization did not turn into sympathy and did not soften their sense of distance, but it introduced nuance, and nuance changes perception quietly because the mind moves from simple categories toward more detailed ones, and detailed understanding often grows from small observations rather than large events. They began to recognize that a nation at war can still carry culture, entertainment, and personal expression at the same time, And this coexistence of conflict and creativity revealed something about the scale of the world beyond their immediate situation, a world large enough to contain both struggle and normal life without one completely erasing the other. For prisoners, such awareness could be stabilizing in a subtle way, because it reminded them that the world itself had not collapsed into chaos, that structure still existed somewhere beyond the fences, and that daily life continued for millions of people, even while war shaped the headlines and the movements of armies. Their own situation remained unchanged, their schedules remained fixed, and their roles inside the camp did not shift. Yet internally, their perception had gained a small expansion, where the image of the outside world included more than uniforms and orders, and this broader picture made their mental map of reality slightly wider. No dramatic conclusions followed, and no visible reactions marked this change, because psychological adjustments often happen quietly, forming part of a person's inner framework without announcement, and men in captivity learn to process experiences privately, storing impressions rather than expressing them openly. The music did not become a source of comfort, and it did not become a source of frustration, but remained a reference point, a reminder that culture travels even where people cannot, and that sound can cross boundaries that bodies cannot, carrying small pieces of another world into restricted spaces. In this way, the experience became less about the music itself and more about perspective, because perspective shapes how a person understands his place in the world, and even a slight widening of perspective can make confinement feel different in the mind, even when it remains the same in reality. By the time the memory settled fully into the background of their thoughts, it had already done its quiet work, not by changing their circumstances, but by adding complexity to how they viewed the society around them. And in a life defined by limits, even a small expansion of understanding counted as a meaningful internal shift. In the end, nothing in their daily life changed because of that music. The fences still marked the limits of their movement. The schedules still organized their hours, and the rules still defined their routines. And yet the experience left a quiet trace in their perception, because it revealed that the world beyond the camp carried on with its own rhythms, interests, and forms of expression even during war. The jazz they heard did not bring them closer to freedom and did not lessen the reality of captivity, but it reminded them that culture continues alongside conflict, that societies do not become only armies, and that civilian life often preserves its own patterns even when history turns difficult. For the prisoners, this understanding did not erase distance, but it added context, and context helps the mind place events within a larger picture, making the world feel more structured and less reduced to simple opposites. What remained was not the melody itself, but the idea behind it, that beyond the fences existed a society complex enough to create music meant for enjoyment rather than command. And this idea quietly expanded how they imagined the country around them. The moment passed, the days continued, and the camp returned to its familiar rhythm. But the memory of that sound stayed as a small reminder that even in wartime, life carries elements that do not belong to conflict, and recognizing this did not change their situation, but it subtly changed how they viewed the world beyond their reach. And sometimes, in the stillness of routine, that memory surfaced again, not as longing and not as regret, but as simple awareness that the world outside remained larger, more varied, and more alive than the narrow space they temporarily lived within. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.